Harry is not in the room. That is the part of this story that matters. Not the robes, not the ceremony, not the official photographs, not the careful smiles outside St. Giles Cathedral, not even the predictable argument about whether Prince Harry and Meghan will be welcomed, avoided, ignored, or quietly managed when they return to Britain. The real story is much colder than that. Because while the public is watching the visible royal theater, the old rituals, the ancient titles, the polished family image, something else appears to be happening behind the doors of Holyroodhouse. A plan is being formed, and Harry is not in the room where that plan is being discussed. That is why this reported family dinner matters, not because senior royals had a meal together, not because the king hosted relatives during Royal Week in Scotland. That happens. That can be explained. That can be placed neatly under the heading of tradition. But the timing changes everything. The king, Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Anne, Prince Edward. Together, at the Palace of Holyroodhouse, just days before Harry's expected return to the United Kingdom. Officially, the reason is easy. It is Royal Week. It is Scotland. It is the Order of the Thistle. It is ceremony, duty, ancient continuity, the kind of royal event that looks so formal and so predictable that nobody is supposed to look too closely at what else it allows. But privately, according to reporting around the dinner, there was plenty to discuss. And when a family like this gathers just before the most complicated son returns home, the question is not whether they talked about him. The question is what tone they agreed on before he even arrived. Because this is the part people often miss about the royal family. They do not only communicate through statements, they communicate through rooms, through invitations, through who is present, through who is absent, through who stands next to whom, through whether a smile lasts 2 seconds or half a second, through whether a meeting happens in private or does not happen at all. And in this case, the most important signal may be the simplest one. Harry is the subject of the conversation, but he is not part of the conversation. And that is why this moment feels different from the usual royal noise. Because most of the coverage is still chasing the surface drama. Will Harry bring Meghan? Will Archie and Lilibet come? Will there be a visit to Diana's grave? Will there be a photograph? Will William react? Will Charles make time? Will Camilla avoid them? Will the family freeze them out or leave one door slightly open? Those questions are loud, but they are not the deepest question. The deeper question is this: has the royal family already decided how Harry is going to be treated before he steps onto British soil? And if they have, what does that say about where he really stands inside the family now? Because there is something quietly devastating about being discussed by your own family as a problem to be managed. Not as a son, not as a brother, not as someone who gets to sit down and say, "This is what I need. This is what I fear. This is what I hope happens next." But as a variable, a risk, a situation, a visit that has to be handled. That is the emotional core of this entire story. And it is why people are reacting so strongly, even if they cannot quite name what feels so uncomfortable about it. Because many people know that feeling. Maybe not inside a palace. Maybe not with titles and uniforms and aides and security briefings. But they know what it feels like when a family gathers without you, talks about you, decides what version of you they are going to accept, and then expects you to walk into the room later and behave as if nothing has already been decided. That is the unease at the center of this. Harry may be returning to Britain, but the family line may already have been written. Now look at the public picture. On the outside, everything is almost aggressively normal. The king and queen are in Scotland. Royal Week continues. The Palace of Holyroodhouse becomes the official residence. The Order of the Thistle brings out the old symbols of Scottish monarchy. There are robes, feathers, processions, chapels, greetings, handshakes, and photographs. It is the monarchy doing what the monarchy does best, turning time into pageantry, turning tension into tradition, turning human mess into something that looks ancient, structured, and calm. And that is exactly why this setting is so useful. Because nobody needs to invent a reason for senior royals to be in the same place. Nobody needs to announce a crisis meeting. Nobody needs to issue a statement saying the family is preparing for Harry's arrival. The diary already gives them cover. The ceremony already gives them a reason. And that is what makes the whole thing so interesting. A formal royal occasion can be a real ceremony and a convenient private opportunity at the same time. Those two things are not contradictions. In fact, inside the royal world, that may be the point. The public sees the ceremony, the family gets the room, and the room is where the real story begins. Because think about the optics. A dinner at Holyroodhouse before the Order of the Thistle service sounds harmless. It sounds traditional. It sounds like senior royals gathering ahead of a major Scottish event. It is almost too official to be suspicious. But then you place it on the timeline. Harry is expected in the United Kingdom within days. Security questions are still hanging over the trip. There are reports about whether Meghan and the children will come. There is talk of royal accommodation. There is the unresolved question of whether the king will see his son and grandchildren. There is the even colder question of whether Prince William will have any contact with his brother at all. And suddenly, this dinner no longer feels like just dinner. It feels like preparation. Not necessarily warm preparation, not necessarily hostile preparation either, but preparation. And with the Windsors, preparation is everything. This is a family institution built on never looking surprised. Whatever is happening privately, the public face must be steady. If Harry arrives, they cannot look caught off guard. If Meghan arrives, they cannot look rattled. If the children come, they cannot look emotionally ambushed. If the visit becomes a media storm, they cannot appear to be improvising. So what do? They get aligned. They decide what is possible. They decide what is not possible. They decide who will meet. They decide who will stay away. They decide what can be photographed. They decide what must never become a photograph. They decide the temperature before the public ever feels the weather. And if you want to understand this family, watch the temperature. Not the headline, the temperature. Because royal conflict rarely announces itself in the most obvious way. It does not always come as a shouted argument, a slammed door, or a dramatic public statement. More often, it arrives as a controlled absence, a polite gap, a scheduling issue, a carefully worded briefing, a face that gives nothing away, a family member who is technically nearby but somehow never available. That is where the story lives. And that is why the Holyroodhouse dinner is worth more attention than another recycled debate about whether Harry and Meghan are wanted back in the fold. Because wanted is the wrong word. This is not only about emotion, it is about control. Who controls the terms of the visit? Who controls the images? Who controls the access? Who controls the family narrative? Who gets to decide whether Harry is treated like a son coming home, a former working royal passing through, or a problem to be contained until the cameras move on? And the uncomfortable answer may be that Harry does not control that. Meghan does not control that. The public certainly does not control that. The decision is likely being shaped by the people inside the institution. And once again, Harry is outside the room. That is why the phrase family dinner almost softens the story too much. Because to most people, a family dinner sounds intimate. Messy maybe, but human. People sit down, share food, talk things through, say the uncomfortable thing, maybe argue, maybe forgive, maybe leave with nothing solved, but at least everyone has had a voice. But a royal family dinner is not always that. Sometimes it is also a strategy session with silverware. Sometimes it is a private alignment meeting inside a public institution. Sometimes it is where the family decides how family emotion will be translated into public protocol. And once that translation happens, the emotion disappears from view. A father becomes the king. A son becomes the Duke of Sussex. A brother becomes a risk to the Prince of Wales's future reign. A grandmother's memory becomes a media flashpoint. A visit becomes an operation. And a family conversation becomes a line to take. That is the phrase to hold on to here. A line to take. Because when public institutions face pressure, they do not just react. They develop a line. They decide what everyone says, what nobody says, what signals are sent, what signals are avoided, and how much warmth can be shown without losing control of the story. For the monarchy, that line might never be written down in a dramatic way. It might not need to be. It can live in shared understanding, in instinct, in the way these people have been trained for decades to know what is expected before it is spoken. And that is where Harry's position becomes so painful, because he knows the system. He grew up inside it. He knows that silence can be a message. He knows that a missing invitation can be a message. He knows that diary commitments can be a message. He knows that a brief meeting can be staged to look generous while still keeping emotional distance intact. He knows that the family can appear perfectly civil while giving absolutely nothing away. So if Harry is watching this from outside, he will understand what the rest of us are trying to decode. He will know that a gathering like this, at this time, is not just background, it is a signal. Now, to be clear, we do not know every word spoken behind those palace doors. We should be careful about pretending we do. Royal reporting often moves through sources, briefings, careful language, and implication. Nobody outside that room can honestly claim to know the full conversation. But we do know the pieces around it. We know senior royals gathered at Holyroodhouse. We know it happened around the order of the Thistle service. We know Harry's expected UK visit was imminent. We know the Sussex family's security questions were still dominating the conversation. We know the relationship between Harry and the royal family remains strained. And we know the monarchy does not leave major public optics to chance when it can avoid it. Put those pieces together, and the story becomes less about one dinner and more about the machinery around Harry's return. That is the lens this video is taking. Not gossip for gossip's sake. Not another shouting match about whether Harry is right, or William is right, or Meghan is to blame, or Charles is weak, or Camilla is cold. That is the endless loop everyone else is already doing. The more important question is this. What happens when a family becomes an institution, and the institution decides it must manage one of its own? Because Harry is not just returning to a country, he is returning to a system that has already learned how to function without him, and that may be the hardest part. The monarchy survived his departure, it survived the interviews, it survived the memoir, it survived the accusations, it absorbed the noise, tightened the circle, elevated the next generation, and kept moving. That does not mean there was no damage. There was damage, but institutions measure damage differently from people. A person asks, can this be healed? An institution asks, can this be contained? And the Holyroodhouse dinner, if we read it through that lens, looks like containment. Not necessarily cruelty, not necessarily panic, containment. A decision that whatever happens when Harry arrives, the senior royals must not look divided, they must not look reactive, they must not hand him the power to set the emotional tone. They must not let the visit become a referendum on the family's guilt, anger, love, or regret. They must present a single front, and that is where the phrase united line becomes so loaded. Because a united line can sound mature, it can sound responsible, it can sound like a family trying to avoid chaos. But for the person outside the room, a united line can feel like a wall. And if you have ever been on the other side of that kind of wall, you know exactly why this story hits differently. Because the hardest thing is not always open conflict. Sometimes the hardest thing is coordinated calm. When everyone suddenly sounds the same. When nobody breaks rank. When nobody says what they really feel. When the door is technically not slammed, but somehow there is no way in. That is the emotional trap Harry may be walking toward. Not a dramatic rejection, not a public confrontation, but something quieter. A family that has already decided the shape of the encounter before he gets there. A family that may greet him, or avoid him, or offer him narrow access, or maintain formal distance, but whatever they do it together. And if you are watching this story closely, that is what you should watch for next. Not the biggest headline, not the loudest commentator. Watch for the small signs. Who appears publicly during the visit? Who disappears? Whether the king makes time. Whether William stays completely separate. Whether Camilla is visible or invisible. Whether any private meeting is acknowledged. Whether the children, if they come, are treated as a bridge or as another security complication. Whether Harry is allowed to look like a son returning home, or only like a visitor passing through. Because the answer may already have been discussed, And the people who discussed it are the people we need to look at next. So before we ask what Charles decided, we need to ask a simpler question. Who was actually in that room, and what does that list tell us about who now controls the royal family's public face? Start with the king. Because if this was just an ordinary family gathering, the guest list would not matter quite so much. But this was not just any group of relatives sitting around a table. This was Charles at the center, surrounded by the people who now matter most to the public structure of the monarchy. Queen Camilla was there. Prince William was there. Princess Anne was there. Prince Edward was there. And that list is not random. That is the inner working circle of the modern royal family. Not the entire family, not every cousin, not every title, not everyone with history, grievance, loyalty, or opinion. This was the group that represents continuity, discipline, seniority, and the public face of the crown. And that is why the composition of the room tells us almost as much as the timing. Charles is the monarch, but he is also Harry's father. That dual role is the impossible tension at the center of every decision about Harry. If Charles is too warm, the institution risks looking weak or divided. If Charles is too cold, he risks confirming the very accusation that the family has become more machine than family. So every move he makes toward Harry is read twice, once as a father, once as the king. And those two readings are not always compatible. That is what makes Charles's position so difficult, and also so revealing. He cannot simply say, "My son is coming home, let us see him privately and handle this like a family," because nothing involving Harry is only private anymore. The second Harry enters Britain, every car movement, every residence, every handshake, every absence becomes part of the public story. So Charles needs alignment. He needs to know how the rest of the senior family will behave. He needs to know whether warmth from him will be supported or undermined by distance from others. He needs to know whether William will tolerate any softening. He needs to know whether Camilla will stay away, appear neutral, or become part of the public choreography. He needs to know whether Anne and Edward, the dependable working royals, will help hold the family line. And that is why this dinner matters, because it places Charles not just as a father waiting for his son, but as a monarch preparing his court. Then there is Camilla. Her presence is important because she is not a side character in Harry's story, no matter how carefully the palace may wish to keep her above the noise. In Harry's public version of events, Camilla has often been part of the wound. She represents not just his father's second marriage, but also, in his telling, the ruthless world of image management, briefing, rehabilitation, and sacrifice. So if Harry returns, Camilla's role becomes delicate. Too visible, and she becomes a provocation for Sussex supporters. Too invisible, and it looks like avoidance. Too warm, and it may feel staged. Too cold, and it becomes a headline. That is the problem with this family now. Even basic civility is no longer simple. A smile is not just a smile. A greeting is not just a greeting. A person being in the same building is not just logistics. Everything is meaning. And Camilla's presence in that room suggests that whatever line is being formed, it cannot be formed without her. She is queen now. She is beside Charles at the center of the reign. And if Harry's visit creates pressure around Charles, it inevitably creates pressure around her too. Then there is William. And William may be the most consequential person in the room after Charles. Because Charles can offer accommodation. Charles can express hope. Charles can, at least in theory, want to see his grandchildren. Charles can still be framed as the father who wants a door left open. But William is the future. And if there is one thing the monarchy protects above almost everything else, it is the future. That is why William's position matters so much. He is not only Harry's brother, he is the next king. He is the person whose reign would inherit the consequences of any reconciliation, any renewed conflict, any public thaw that later collapses into another interview, another book, another accusation, another leak, another cycle of blame. For William, this is not just about one visit. It is about precedent. If Harry returns and is publicly embraced, what does that mean after everything that has happened? If Harry is allowed back into warm family imagery, does that blur the line between working royals and non-working royals? If Harry appears near the center again, even briefly, Does it reopen a door William believes should stay closed? And if William refuses contact entirely, does that make him look hard, unforgiving, or simply disciplined? That is why his presence at Holyroodhouse matters, because no serious family line on Harry can be built without knowing where William stands. And if William's position remains firm, then Charles's room for movement may be much smaller than people imagine. This is where many viewers split. Some will say, William has every right to keep his distance after what Harry said publicly. Others will say, if even brothers cannot find a way to speak, what hope is there for the family? But the point here is not to force a verdict. The point is to understand the power dynamic. Harry can request. Charles can consider. But William can shape the emotional limits of what is possible. Because William represents the monarchy after Charles, and any decision that affects Harry's proximity to the family also affects William's future court, William's children, and William's version of royal stability. That is why this is not only a father and son story anymore. It is a succession story. It is a story about what the monarchy is willing to carry forward and what it wants to seal off before the next reign. Then there is Princess Anne. Anne's presence gives the room a different kind of weight. She is not sentimental in the public imagination. She is not seen as someone who performs emotional softness for cameras. She is viewed as duty, stamina, discipline, old-school royal service. She is the family member people often describe as practical, blunt, and unmoved by drama. So if Anne is in the room, the tone is unlikely to be theatrical. Her presence suggests seriousness, a focus on duty, a focus on what protects the institution, a focus on what has to happen, not what would make the best emotional headlines. And that matters because Harry's story often invites emotion. His mother, his childhood, his grief, his exit, his anger, his need for safety, his children, his desire to bring them to Britain. It is a deeply emotional story. But when that story is placed in front of people like Anne, it may be filtered through a very different question. Not, how does Harry feel, but, what is the family's responsibility to the crown? That may sound cold. It may even feel cold. But inside the royal system, duty has always been the language that turns personal pain into manageable behavior. And Anne speaks that language fluently. Then there is Prince Edward. Edward's role is quieter, but that does not mean it is meaningless. He and Sophie have become part of the monarchy's stabilizing layer. They are not the center of the drama, and that is partly why they are useful. They represent service without constant crisis. They can appear at events, support the king, carry out duties, and reinforce the impression that the institution continues calmly while the louder stories swirl around it. In a moment like this, Edward's presence says something about consolidation. The senior working family is smaller now, the margins are tighter, the bench is thinner, and the people who remain close to the king are the people expected to keep the show steady. That is why Harry's absence from the working center is not just personal, it is structural. The family has reorganized around the people who stayed, and that makes any return, even a temporary one, complicated. Because Harry is not coming back to the family he left. He is coming back to a family that has already adapted to his absence. That may be the quietest and hardest truth in this story. When someone leaves a family system, there is often an assumption that the empty chair stays empty forever, that everyone is waiting for the missing person to return, that the door is still open in exactly the same way, that the old place can simply be reclaimed. But families do not freeze in time. They rearrange. They create new routines. They redistribute power. They tell new stories about why things happened. They get used to the silence. And sometimes, by the time the absent person comes back, they discover the family has not been waiting in the way they imagined. The room still exists, but their chair has been moved. That is what Harry may be facing, and it is why the guest list at Holyroodhouse feels so loaded, because the people at that table are the people whose chairs are still in the center. Harry's is not. Now there is another absence people will notice. Catherine. The Princess of Wales was not part of the reported dinner list, and this needs to be handled carefully, because not every absence is a scandal. Catherine has had a different public rhythm after her health challenges, and it would be irresponsible to turn every missing appearance into a dramatic theory. Sometimes an absence is simply an absence. But in royal storytelling, absence still has meaning because the public reads patterns, and Catherine's absence from this particular reported gathering matters mainly because she is central to William's public image and to the monarchy's future. She is not just William's wife, she is the future queen. She is also one of the few members of the family who can soften the monarchy's image without saying very much at all. Her presence often signals warmth, continuity, motherhood, stability, and emotional reassurance. So if the line on Harry is being discussed by senior royals, and Catherine is not in that reported room, that can suggest a few things. It may suggest the discussion was limited to the most senior working royals present in Scotland. It may suggest the issue was being handled at the level of Charles, William, and the older institutional core. It may suggest that Catherine's role, if any, is being kept separate from the immediate strategy. Or it may simply reflect practical circumstances. But either way, the visual is striking. The people who represent the hard structure of the monarchy are gathered. The person most associated with softening William's public image is not part of the visible list. And that gives the story a colder tone. Because if Catherine had been there, some viewers might imagine a slightly more human bridge, a possibility of softness. A reminder that this is not only about kings and heirs, but about a wider family with children, memories, and old bonds. Without her in the reported room, the gathering feels more institutional, more senior, more controlled, more like the monarchy deciding what to do with Harry, rather than the family trying to emotionally understand him. And that brings us back to the setting, Holyroodhouse. Because the location is not just a backdrop, it is one of those royal places where private family life and public power sit on top of each other. The Palace of Holyroodhouse is an official royal residence in Scotland. It is associated with ceremony, history, royal presence, and the annual rhythm of the monarchy in Edinburgh. That makes it perfect for this kind of moment. Not because anything secret must have happened there, but because it allows everything to look normal. And that is one of the monarchy's greatest skills, making the extraordinary look routine. A gathering that might seem dramatic in another setting becomes almost invisible when wrapped in ceremony. Imagine if Charles had suddenly summoned William, Anne, Edward, and Camilla to a private emergency meeting in London days before Harry arrived. The headlines would be explosive. Everyone would know exactly what it looked like. The word crisis would appear everywhere. But place the gathering inside Royal Week in Scotland, before the Order of the Thistle, and it becomes deniable. It becomes traditional. It becomes part of the diary. The ceremony absorbs the tension. And that is why the Order of the Thistle matters as more than a pretty historical detail. It gives the family a reason to be together that nobody can reasonably challenge. The order itself is one of Scotland's great chivalric traditions. It comes with ancient symbolism, formal dress, St. Giles's Cathedral, and the kind of pageantry that allows the monarchy to present itself as older than any present conflict. That is useful. Because Harry's conflict with the family is modern, raw, emotional, media-driven, and personal. The Order of the Thistle is old, formal, controlled, and institutional. Put those two things beside each other, and you can see the contrast. On the street, the cameras see robes and ritual. Inside, the family may be dealing with the consequences of interviews, lawsuits, security concerns, estrangement, and a possible Sussex return. That contrast is the story. The old monarchy is being used to manage the new crisis. And if you are still watching at this point, notice how different that is from the usual question of whether Harry is being welcomed or rejected. This is not a simple yes or no. It is about how the institution turns a messy human problem into something it can choreograph. That is why I want you to comment on this, because the answer says a lot about how you read the whole situation. Do you think a united family line is responsible because the monarchy cannot afford another round of chaos? Or do you think it is cruel because it means Harry is once again being handled as a problem instead of heard as a person? That is the divide. And the palace knows that divide exists, which is why the line they choose has to be careful. Too much warmth, and critics will say Harry was rewarded after attacking the family. Too much coldness, and critics will say the monarchy has learned nothing, that it still cannot respond to pain with anything except distance. Too much visibility, and the visit becomes a Sussex spectacle. Too little visibility, and the absence becomes the story. This is the impossible royal equation. Every option creates a headline. So the family does what it has always done. It tries to control the frame. And a controlled frame begins with everyone knowing their place. That may be what united line really means. Not one dramatic decision, not one explosive instruction, but a shared understanding of the boundaries. Charles may have one boundary, William may have another, Camilla may have another, Anne may have a more institutional boundary. Edward may be there to reinforce the stable center. Together, they create the tone Harry will meet. And here is the uncomfortable part. A united line does not have to look hostile to feel exclusionary. It can be polite. It can be quiet. It can even be technically respectful. Harry can be offered accommodation and still be kept at emotional distance. He can be given a private meeting and still be denied any public sign of full restoration. He can be acknowledged as the king's son and still be treated as someone outside the working royal circle. He can be near the family and still not be inside the family. That is the strange halfway place he occupies now. Not fully banished, not fully included, not a stranger, not trusted, not irrelevant, not central. And that is a painful position because it keeps the wound open. If the door were completely closed, at least the message would be clear. If the door were fully open, reconciliation would have a shape. But this middle space, this controlled, conditional, carefully managed space, is where people can spend years waiting for a warmth that never quite arrives. And that may be exactly where the monarchy prefers Harry to remain. Close enough that Charles cannot be accused of total rejection. Far enough that William's future is protected. Visible enough that the family looks humane. Contained enough that the institution stays in control. That is not emotional reconciliation. That is management. And management is what royal protocol does best. Now, if you find this kind of breakdown useful, subscribe, because the next few days are going to be read through tiny details, not through big declarations, through timing, through who appears, through which palace confirms what, through which source says no plans and which source says the door remains open. That is where the truth usually leaks out in royal stories, because the palace rarely says the hard thing directly. It lets arrangements speak. And the arrangements around Harry's visit may tell us more than any statement ever could. This is why we have to be precise about what could be decided behind closed doors. A united line could mean formal neutrality. That would look like this. The family does not attack Harry. They do not brief aggressively. They do not create new drama. But they also do not give him the emotional reunion image that would dominate every front page. Charles may make time if schedules and security allow. William remains separate. Camilla keeps a dignified distance. The rest of the family carries on with duties. That would be the cleanest institutional option. It gives no dramatic rejection, but also no dramatic embrace. A united line could also mean controlled warmth. That would mean Charles allows a private family moment, perhaps especially if Archie and Lilibet are involved, but the palace keeps it away from cameras and refuses to let it become a public Sussex victory lap. In that version, the king can still be a grandfather without letting the visit become a royal relaunch. But controlled warmth is risky, because private warmth often becomes public speculation. If Harry sees Charles, people will ask why William did not. If the children see their grandfather, people will ask whether photographs were taken. If Meghan is present, people will ask whether Camilla was present. Every bridge creates another question. A united line could also mean complete emotional distance, no public reunion, no brotherly meeting, no image, no visible thaw. The family carries on as if Harry's presence in the country is just one more external event happening around the royal calendar. That would be the coldest version. But it would also be the clearest version of where things stand. And perhaps that is exactly why it is dangerous. Because if Harry returns and the family gives him nothing, the story becomes not Harry's behavior, but the monarchy's hardness. And Charles in particular may not want that. Especially not if the visit involves his grandchildren. That is the human complication inside the institutional plan. Harry is not coming alone as a headline. He may be coming as a father who wants his children to know their grandfather, and who wants them to know the country that is part of their identity. That changes the emotional stakes. Because the public can argue endlessly about Harry and Meghan, but Archie and Lilibet are different. They did not give interviews. They did not write books. They did not choose the family rupture. They are children inside the consequences of adult decisions. So if the royal family appears to shut the door too firmly, the optics can become brutal, not because the palace owes the Sussexes a public embrace, but because the king is also a grandfather. And when a grandfather is ill, when time feels more fragile, when years have already passed, the question of whether he sees his grandchildren becomes harder to turn into protocol. That may be one of the most sensitive things discussed. Not just, how do we handle Harry, but how do we handle the children? Because the children are where the institutional line and the human line collide. If they come, does the family make space for them? If they do not come, does the palace express regret? If security prevents the visit, does Charles stay out of it, as reports suggest he intends to do? Because security decisions are not supposed to be his to control. And if Charles stays out of it, will Harry read that as constitutional restraint or as personal abandonment? That is the tragedy of this situation. Every side has a language the other side does not fully accept. The palace speaks in procedure. Harry speaks in personal impact. The palace says, this is how the system works. Harry hears, you are choosing the system over me. The palace says, security is not a private family favor. Harry hears, my family is not being protected. The palace says, we cannot let one visit destabilize the crown. Harry hears, I am still being treated as a threat. And somewhere between those two languages, the possibility of a simple family conversation disappears. That is why being outside the room matters so much. Because if Harry were inside, he could argue his case. He could say, this is what I actually need. He could hear directly what Charles fears. He could hear directly what William will not accept. He could answer the questions being asked about him. But if the conversation happens without him, then he receives only the result, not the emotion behind it, not the debate, not the hesitation, only the line. And a line, once agreed, can feel impossible to break. That is the cold power of family consensus. One person rejecting you hurts, but a whole room aligning around how to handle you feels different. It feels like the door has been quietly reinforced from the inside. And the next piece of this is timing, because this did not happen in a vacuum. It happened days before the visit window, and with the Windsors, days are not just days, they are signals. And this timeline is one of the loudest signals in the whole story, because when a private family gathering happens 6 or 7 days before a visit that is already emotionally loaded, legally complicated, security sensitive, and media heavy, it is very hard to treat that as background. The timing asks us to pay attention. A dinner on Tuesday night, the order of the Thistle service on Wednesday, Harry's expected return within days. That is not a random emotional landscape. That is a countdown. And the royal family understands countdowns better than almost anyone. They understand what happens before a public event. They understand what happens before a difficult appearance. They understand how many small decisions have to be made before the cameras see anything at all. Who is briefed? Who is protected? Who is visible? Who is not? What is confirmed? What is left vague? What is answered? What is ignored? What is allowed to look warm? What must remain clinical? By the time the public sees the first image, the important choices may already be made. That is why this reported dinner matters so much. Because the public may experience Harry's visit in real time, but the family is likely preparing for it in advance. And preparation changes the meaning of every later gesture. If Charles meets Harry, it may not simply be a father spontaneously choosing tenderness. It may be the approved level of access. If William does not meet Harry, it may not simply be a busy schedule. It may be the agreed boundary. If Camilla is not seen near the Sussexes, it may not simply be coincidence. It may be distance by design. If Anne and Edward continue with engagements as usual, that may not simply be normal royal work. It may be the family showing that the institution does not bend its rhythm around Harry. This is how the monarchy turns a personal crisis into a controlled public sequence. And this is why the phrase, "nothing happens by accident," is repeated so often in royal coverage. It is not literally true. Of course accidents happen. Of course human beings make mistakes. Of course diaries change, people get tired, plans fall apart, and not every tiny movement is a coded message. But in a high-pressure moment like this, the broad shape is almost never accidental. The broad shape is chosen. The broad shape is negotiated. The broad shape is protected. And right now, the broad shape appears to be this. Harry is coming toward the family, but the family is gathering without him first. That is the image you cannot unsee. Before Harry arrives, the senior royals align. Before Harry speaks, the family line may be set. Before Harry can ask for warmth, the temperature may already be fixed. And that brings us to the emotional question at the end of all this. What does it do to a person to know that your family is deciding how to handle you? Not how to love you, not how to understand you, not how to repair what broke, how to handle you. That word is cold, but it fits the situation. Because Harry has become something the monarchy has to handle. His presence has to be handled. His wife has to be handled. His children have to be handled. His security concerns have to be handled. His relationship with his father has to be handled. His rupture with William has to be handled. Even his grief around Diana becomes something that has to be handled, because anything connected to Diana can become an emotional force the palace cannot fully control. And that may be the most painful layer here. Harry's connection to Diana is one of the few things the institution cannot simply neutralize. The public still responds to it. The public still understands that wound. The public still sees the little boy behind the adult conflict. And if his visit involves Diana's memory, Althorpe, her grave, or even the symbolism of returning around what would have been a deeply emotional family date, then the monarchy faces something it cannot easily convert into protocol. Because Diana is not just history. Diana is emotional memory. And emotional memory is dangerous for institutions because it does not obey the diary. It makes people feel. It makes people compare. It makes people ask whether the family has changed or whether the same patterns are repeating with another generation. That is why the public argument about Diana's grave, photos, and family symbolism has become so noisy. But again, that noise may be distracting from the deeper mechanism. While everyone argues about whether a photo is appropriate, the senior royals may be deciding the bigger question. How do we prevent this visit from becoming Harry's emotional stage? Because if Harry arrives with Meghan and the children, if he is seen near Diana's resting place, if he is also trying to see Charles, if security questions remain unresolved, then the story can quickly become larger than one trip. It can become a story about exile and return, about a son trying to bring his children home, about a grandfather and limited time, about Diana's two sons still standing on opposite sides of a family fracture, about whether the royal family can forgive, or whether it only knows how to endure. That is powerful material, and the palace knows it. So the palace will try to keep the story narrow. Dates, security, accommodation, private family matters, no comment. Diary commitments, no plans. The king's door remains open. The Prince of Wales is focused on his work. The family wishes everyone well. These phrases sound harmless, but they are tools. They reduce emotion into manageable language. They prevent one human story from overtaking the institution's message. But Harry's whole public life since leaving has been a fight against that reduction. He has repeatedly tried to say, "Do not turn my pain into a line. Do not turn my wife's suffering into a palace briefing. Do not turn my family's safety into a technicality. Do not turn my mother into an image while ignoring what happened to her." Whether viewers agree with every choice Harry has made or not, that is the emotional pattern. He speaks personally, the palace responds institutionally, and then both sides feel confirmed in their worst fears. Harry sees coldness, the palace sees instability. Harry feels unheard, the palace feels exposed. Harry pushes harder, the palace closes ranks. And here we are again. A visit is approaching, the family gathers, the line is formed, and Harry is outside the room. That is why this moment feels like a repetition, but also like an escalation, because this time, it may not be only about Harry, It may involve Meghan. It may involve Archie and Lilibet. It may involve whether the king sees his grandchildren. It may involve security decisions that Harry believes are fundamental to whether his family can safely come at all. And it may involve William's absolute refusal to let the old brotherly bond be used as a public bridge before trust has been rebuilt privately. That is a lot to put inside one visit. Too much, maybe. And that is exactly why the family would want a united line. Because if each person reacts differently, the visit becomes chaotic. Charles shows warmth, William shows distance, Camilla disappears, sources brief against each other, Harry feels slighted, Meghan feels targeted, the public picks sides, and suddenly one trip becomes another royal crisis. A united line prevents that. But it also freezes the human element. That is the trade. Control protects the institution. Control can also suffocate reconciliation. And this is where the audience has to decide what it believes the monarchy is trying to do. Is the family trying to protect itself from another unpredictable media storm? Or is the family refusing to create any real space for Harry to return as a human being rather than a controversy? Maybe both are true. That is what makes this story so compelling. There may be no clean villain in the room. There may only be people with incompatible fears. Charles may fear losing his son completely, while also fearing another public rupture. William may fear that any softness will reopen a door to more betrayal. Camilla may fear becoming the target again. Anne may fear that personal emotion will weaken duty. Edward may fear that the family cannot afford another destabilizing cycle when the working monarchy is already small. Harry may fear that he will never be treated as family again unless he accepts silence on terms he cannot live with. And Meghan may fear that any return to Britain places her and her children back inside a system she believes harmed them. Those fears do not cancel each other out. They collide. And when royal fears collide, they do not usually produce an honest family conversation. They produce protocol. That is why, over the next few days, the most important thing to watch will not be what anyone says loudly. It will be what the choreography reveals. If Harry is seen only at Invictus-related events and charity commitments, with no visible royal contact, that tells us something. If Charles offers a private meeting, but keeps it entirely hidden, that tells us something. If William remains completely separate, that tells us something. If palace sources stress that the king's schedule is full, that tells us something. If sources close to Harry stress that the issue is security, not accommodation, that tells us something. If Meghan and the children do not come, that tells us something too. Not necessarily that one side won or lost, but that the line behind the scenes had limits. And this is why the Holyroodhouse dinner may become more important after the visit than it looks before the visit. Right now, it is a clue. Later, it may look like the moment the tone was set. Because if the royal family moves in perfect formation when Harry arrives, we will know that formation did not appear out of nowhere. It was prepared. If the response is cold but polite, it was prepared. If the response is warm but contained, it was prepared. If the response is silence, that silence was prepared too. And maybe that is the most royal outcome of all. A silence that has been discussed, a smile that has been measured, a family distance that looks effortless because it was agreed in advance. That is the part that makes this story so chilling. Not that the family may reject Harry, not that they may welcome him, but that either option can be turned into choreography. And for Harry, that means even the emotional moments may not feel fully free. If Charles sees him, Harry may wonder whether it was fatherly desire or institutional calculation. If Charles does not see him, Harry may wonder whether his father chose distance or was boxed in by the wider family line. If William avoids him, Harry may wonder whether the brother he lost is gone for good. If the family gives him only protocol, Harry may wonder whether there is any private family left beneath the crown at all. That is a brutal place to stand, and it explains why this story keeps drawing people in even after years of royal conflict. Because beneath all the titles, this is a family question. What happens when the people who know you best no longer speak to you directly, but still meet to decide what to do about you? What happens when your return is planned like a risk? What happens when your children become part of a negotiation between love, security, image, and control? What happens when the door is not closed, but everyone inside has already agreed how far it may open? That is the true tension of this visit. Not whether Harry is popular, not whether Meghan is liked, not whether William is right to be angry, not whether Charles is doing enough. Those questions matter, but they are not the center. The center is exclusion. Harry is once again outside the room where his place in the family is being defined. And the tragedy is that this has always been one of his deepest complaints, that decisions were made around him, that narratives were built around him, that protection was negotiated around him, that his pain was interpreted by people who were not living it, that the institution always had a meeting, a line, a strategy, a way forward, while he was expected to absorb the consequences. Now the pattern appears again: a room, a senior circle, a coming visit, a united line, and Harry outside it. If this video is helping you see the story through the structure, rather than just the noise, give it a like, because the next stage of this will be all about details that look small until you connect them. A car route, a palace confirmation, a phrase in a briefing, a missing brother, a grandfather's schedule, a private meeting that may or may not be acknowledged, a smile that looks polite but not warm, a silence that says more than a statement. That is where we will see what was really decided, because we probably will not get a direct answer. There will be no palace announcement saying, "Here is the family's strategy for Harry." There will be no official note saying, "William agreed to this, Camilla preferred that, Anne advised caution, Edward backed the king, and Charles chose the narrow path between father and monarch." That is not how this works. Instead, we will get fragments, and the fragments will tell the story. If Harry arrives and the family keeps him at arm's length, we will understand the dinner differently. If Harry arrives and Charles quietly makes room for him, we will understand the dinner differently. If the children come and are kept entirely out of view, we will understand the stakes differently. If Meghan does not come, we will ask whether security made the decision or whether the family line made the visit too complicated to risk. And if William remains absent from every possible point of contact, then the message will be unmistakable. The brotherly relationship is not paused. It is sealed off, at least for now. That would be the most consequential sign, because Charles's reign is temporary by nature. Every reign is. But William's future is the long-term direction of the monarchy. If William will not reopen the door, then Harry's access to the family may depend on a father whose power is personal, but whose time is limited. That is a painful thought. But it may be central to understanding why Harry's return feels so urgent and so fragile. A son may still want his father. A brother may no longer want the risk. And the institution may choose the brother who represents the future. That does not mean Charles has no agency. It means Charles is balancing love against legacy. And legacy usually wins inside palaces. That is why the image of Holyroodhouse matters so much. An old palace, a formal royal week, a sacred order, a family dinner, a son on the outside. It is almost too perfect as a symbol. The monarchy wrapped in history, deciding how to handle the most emotional, unresolved problem of the present. And the person at the center of that problem is not there. So when Harry arrives, do not only ask whether he gets a meeting, ask what kind of meeting it is. Do not only ask whether Charles sees the children, ask whether the moment is allowed to feel human, or whether it is kept so controlled that it becomes another piece of palace management. Do not only ask whether William speaks to Harry. Ask whether William's absence has become the new royal policy. Do not only ask whether Meghan comes, ask whether the conditions around the visit made her presence practically impossible, emotionally impossible, or strategically unwanted. And most of all, do not mistake quiet for peace. The royal family is very good at quiet. Quiet can mean dignity. Quiet can mean discipline. Quiet can mean grief. Quiet can mean anger. Quiet can mean the decision has already been made and nobody is going to explain it to you. That may be where we are now. We do not know exactly what was said behind the doors of Holyroodhouse. We do not know whether Charles argued for warmth, whether William insisted on distance, Whether Camilla preferred avoidance, whether Anne pushed duty, whether Edward simply helped steady the room. We do not know the words, but we know the pattern. The senior family gathered, the visit was close, the stakes were high, and Harry was not there. That is enough to understand the emotional shape of the story. Because sometimes the most important person in a meeting is the person everyone is discussing after they have left, or before they arrive, or without ever being invited at all. And that is Harry's position now. He is close enough to dominate the conversation, but not close enough to shape the decision. He is still the king's son, but he is no longer inside the royal circle that decides how the family presents itself. He is still part of the story, but not part of the room. And in a family like this, the room is everything. So over the next few days, watch carefully. Watch the gestures. Watch the timing. Watch the official language. Watch who stays visible and who disappears. Watch whether Charles looks like a father being given space to see his son, or a monarch performing the minimum required warmth. Watch whether William leaves even the smallest opening, or whether the silence between the brothers becomes the loudest message of the visit. Because the decision may already be made, not in public, not in a headline, not in a dramatic confrontation, but quietly, privately, around a table in an old Scottish palace, under the cover of ceremony and tradition. And when Harry steps back into Britain, he may not be walking into an open conversation. He may be walking into the result of one. A conversation about him, a strategy around him, a family line built without him. That is what is really being decided. And that is why this story is not about dinner. It is about the door.